Okay, so you know how everyone loves a good legal thriller, right?
Yeah.
All the twists and turns.
Yeah.
But what if I told you that some of the biggest nail biters aren't happening in the courtroom?
Oh, interesting.
They're actually happening behind the scenes with something as seemingly mundane as a deposition summary.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
We're talking about those critical documents, the ones that can literally make or break a case. And today, we're going deep on a question that's on a lot of legal minds these days. Can remote summary services really cut it? Can they actually meet all those crazy strict legal standards?
It's a question I hear a lot, and for good reason, because when we talk about legal compliance in this context, we're not just talking about ticking boxes. We're talking about protecting your clients, your reputation, and the very integrity of the legal process. And that's not something you want to gamble with.
And I imagine confidentiality is a huge part of that equation.
Absolutely. We're talking about information that's often highly sensitive, right?
Yeah.
Financial records, medical histories, trade secrets, you name it. If that information falls into the wrong hands, well, let's just say the consequences can be pretty disastrous.
So we're talking potential mistrials, lawsuits, reputations, completely shot.
All of that and more, which is why you can't just hope for the best when it comes to choosing a provider.
Okay, so it's not enough to just trust that they're doing things right.
Yeah.
What should we actually be looking for? What are some concrete signs that a provider takes confidentiality seriously?
Well, for starters, they need to be compliant with all the relevant regulations. And I'm not just talking about the obvious ones like HIPAA.
Which, by the way, a lot of people think HIPAA only applies to healthcare, but it actually covers any personally identifiable information.
Exactly. So even though we're talking about legal documents, if those documents contain things like medical records or billing statements, HIPAA still applies.
Okay, that makes sense. So HIPAA compliance is a must-have, but it's not the be-all and end-all, right?
Right. You also need to make sure they've got those airtight security protocols in place. Think data encryption, secure servers, the whole 9 yards. You want to make sure that information is locked down tight.
It's like building a fortress around that data.
Exactly. And not just anyone can have the keys to that fortress. You want a provider with strict access controls.
Right, so who has access to what and when?
And are they doing their due diligence with employee training and background checks? These are all critical questions to ask.
Because if just anyone can get in there and start poking around,
That's a recipe for disaster.
speaking of dotting our I's and crossing our dits, let's talk about those often overlooked court rules. Can you really trust a remote service to be on top of all those little details?
Well, that's where things can get a little dicey, you know?
Huh.
Because we both know those court rules, they're not exactly one size fits all, are they?
Oh, tell me about it. Different jurisdictions, different judges. Sometimes it feels like they change the rules just to keep us on our toes.
Right. And the thing is, even those seemingly minor details, those little nuances, they can make all the difference.
It's like that old saying, the devil's in the details, right?
Yeah,
And in the legal world, those details can be deal breakers.
absolutely. I'm talking motions to strike, evidence deemed inadmissible. I've even seen cases thrown out entirely because of a misplaced comma or an incorrect citation.
Wow, that's a scary thought. So we're not just talking about typos here. We're talking about a deep understanding of legal language,
Yeah.
knowing how to craft those summaries so they hold up under scrutiny.
Exactly. You need a provider who's not just transcribing, they're actively processing that information, understanding the nuances, making sure everything is airtight.
So it's not just about speed, it's about precision.
100%. A good deposition summary, it's not just a verbatim transcript, it's a strategic document.
Okay, so we've talked about confidentiality. We've talked about the importance of adhering to those all-important court rules. What else should we be looking at when we're evaluating a provider? What else screams competence?
Well, this is where their commitment to ongoing training comes in. Because, as we know, the legal landscape, it's not exactly static, is it?
Always changing. New laws, new precedents, new technologies.
Yeah.
It's enough to make your head spin sometimes.
Right. And you need a provider who's committed to keeping up with all of it.
So it's not enough to just have a law degree on the wall. They need to be constantly learning, adapting, expanding their knowledge base.
Exactly. Think about it this way. If you went to a doctor and found out they hadn't cracked open a medical journal since they graduated, you'd be a little concerned, right?
Yeah, that's a terrifying thought. And speaking of things that would be concerning, I imagine a lack of transparency would also be a major red flag.
Oh, absolutely. Transparency is huge. And it goes beyond just being upfront about their fees, although that's important too. You want a provider who's willing to pull back the curtain on their entire operation.
So what does that look like in practice? How do you know if a provider is truly being transparent?
Well, start with their website. Do they have a detailed privacy policy?
Because everyone reads those,
Right.
right?
You'd be surprised. But seriously, it should be easy to find, easy to understand. And what about their security protocols? Do they clearly outline how they protect your data?
It's like that old saying, if you're not sure, always read the fine print.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask for client testimonials or case studies. A reputable provider should be more than happy to share examples of their work.
It's about providing that peace of mind, knowing you're entrusting your client's sensitive information to a team that knows what they're doing.
Right. Because at the end of the day, it's all about trust.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. Confidentiality, adherence to court rules, a commitment to ongoing training, and now transparency. It feels like we're building a pretty solid checklist for anyone even thinking about using a remote summary service.
Definitely. And I think it's important to connect the dots here. We've talked a lot about the importance of compliance, but what happens when those standards aren't met? What's the worst case scenario if you choose a provider who cuts corners?
It's the kind of scenario that makes you want to double check your malpractice insurance, right?
Exactly.
What are the potential consequences here?
Well, the fallout, it can be pretty rough, to be honest.
We're talking about derailing an entire case here.
Potentially, yeah. Imagine this. You're in court, relying on a deposition summary that you thought was rock solid, and then boom, it's like a house of cards. Because it's full of inaccuracies, or it doesn't hold up against those court rules we talked about.
Oof, talk about a nightmare scenario.
And the worst part is, it doesn't end there. Opposing counsel, they're not going to miss a beat.
Oh, they'll be all over it.
Exactly. Motions to strike, accusing you of negligence, you name it. And then there's your client.
Yeah, but they're trusting you, it's shaken.
At best.
Yeah.
And then there's the hit to your firm's reputation.
Because word travels fast in the legal world.
Oh, you know it does. And let's be real, a reputation for cutting corners, that's not exactly a selling point.
No, not at all. And I think this brings up another crucial point, which is the ethical dimension. Because at the end of the day, we're not just talking about paperwork.
Right.
We have a duty to our clients, to the courts, to the integrity of the entire legal process.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Compliance, it's not just a box to tick. It's about upholding those ethical standards every step of the way.
It's about doing things right, even when no one's watching. Because at the end of the day, it's about trust. And that's something you can't put a price tag on.
Well said. Well said.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of deposition summaries, I think the takeaway here is pretty clear.
Do your research.
Don't cut corners.
Ask the tough questions.
Demand transparency. And remember, when it comes to those crucial legal documents, choosing the right provider can make all the difference.
It can be a real game changer.
It absolutely can. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.